Hello and welcome to our webinar today, where our panel of experts will be discussing a brand new standard, BS 30440, validation framework for the use of AI in healthcare. First, a couple of housekeeping points. This is a listen-only webinar that is being recorded. We welcome your questions via the Q&A function. We will hold a short Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. Just simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel to post your question. If you experience any technical difficulties, please submit your issue via the Q&A function. And upon completion of the feedback survey, we will send you a link to the recording of the webinar. This is a CPD recognised webinar. Please request your certificate via the feedback survey following the webinar. So I'm Nikki Packer, I'm a Standards Development Manager at BSI, and as I said, we'll be discussing a brand new standard today. So over to Haydar to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki, and hello everyone. Thank you all for your interest in this standard. By way of introduction, my name is Haydar Hussain, and it's been my privilege to convene and chair the panel that has authored BS 30440. In my day job, I serve as Chief Operating Officer of Health Innova, a health tech consultancy. I also serve on the board of the MHRA, as well as my local hospital, Milton Keynes, and as an associate non-exec for the Bucks, Oxfordshire and Berkshire West Integrated Care Board. Previously, I've worked for both Microsoft and GE Healthcare, and also for Caradigm, a joint venture between the two companies, where I for the Euro organization as it's to chair today's panel. And in a moment, the panel will spend a few minutes highlighting the genesis of this standard, including the why, who, and how, and then hand over to Danny to provide you with a brief overview of the standard itself. After this, we'll attempt to answer as many of your pre-submitted questions as possible. However, as we had nearly 100, I'm sure you can understand that we won't get through them all. We aim to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any new questions submitted during the webinar, as Nikki mentioned, via the chat function. I hope you find today's session interesting and informative. Now, if I could ask my fellow panelists to turn their cameras on, please. Fabulous, thank you. So in the order of the slides, Abdul, please, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Haydar. I am truly honored to be speaking to you today about this standard. I have been working in the medical device sector for the last 20 years or so. The journey has been a fascinating one, starting as an engineer in the creation of medical devices, now focusing on standardization. I've witnessed an incredible evolution of the field. My background is in computer vision and machine learning, so I have a keen interest in this field. I am involved in several international standards on medical devices and some on AI for medical devices. This is what led me to get interested in this standard. I am particularly interested in the interplay between the international efforts followed by the BSI's approach and what learning we can take from this, especially as the BSI standards has been in development for about 2-3 years. I joined the group late, you could say, so I was late to the party. In fact, I started asking a lot of questions to Haydar. I'm sure he will attest to this from outside the group. To my delight, the group graciously invited me to collaborate and contribute alongside them. My particular interest is in bias, especially within healthcare environment. With a diverse population in UK, it's crucial that we remain vigilant and address bias proactively. That said, it is my privilege to introduce to you our next speaker, Alison Gardner, Senior Scientific Advisor, NICE, and co-founder of AI in Women Leading in AI. Over to you, Alison.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to the webinar. I work, as I said, as a senior scientific advisor on the AI and Digital Regulation Service. I'm based in NICE, but we work with CQC, MHRA and HRA, as well as with wider stakeholders addressing the use of AI and digital technologies within healthcare. My own background in the vague history of time as a clinical biochemist, and did research in developing prediction models for disease, and I got very involved in AI ethics following that, and I'm now an AI ethicist and expert in that. I worked in a variety of standards, including the in another body, and with BSI, working with Amy on 38, I can never remember the names now, 149, 389, the one that is an addendum to 14971. I did the bias stuff on that, and sitting on various sort of national committees with SC42 and CENELEC. So I got involved in standards there, and I got involved in BS 30440 because at the time there was very little on healthcare as a real focus. A lot of generic standards, a lot of software as a medical device standards, but nothing that had a holistic approach to use of AI within healthcare. So this is why I joined right from the very beginning. And I shall pass over now to Lorna.
Thanks, Alison. I think we'll skip Lorna because she's having problems with the webcam, and we'll come back to her at the end. So if we could go to Joe, please.
Hi, my name is Joseph Connor. I belong to Careful AI. We specialize in the assurance and safety and research around AI systems. Previous life, I used to be in NHS Digital on the AI innovation side and worked as a CTO in Health Board. When I think back to 21, when we were looking at issues that were popping up in our work, which were associated with profiling the risk associated with investment in AI, the big thing that came over time and again was the lack of collaboration around buyer and supplier on the design and the development and deployment of AI systems. And then I met Hader and Danny, and I realized that there's a group of people that wanted to address that issue and to do it in a village of people, because it's not just us that you see today, but there's been a village of people, and it takes a village to raise the standard, and that's what they've done. It's involved both suppliers, buyers, clinicians. It's been a fantastic journey, and I've really enjoyed it, and I think it's a very valuable piece of work, and as a standard, I hope it does get deployed. I'm now going to hand over to Danny, who can give you a bit more background.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everybody. So I'm the AI clinical lead at Guy's Cancer at Guy's and St Thomas NHS Trust. I'm not an AI scientist. I'm not even an oncologist. I'm a public health doctor by background. And it was actually, I was appointed in 2018, and it was, I think at that time, apart from Indra Joshi, I don't think there was anybody else in the NHS that had that title of AI clinical lead, certainly not in a hospital. Before I was appointed, when I was Director of Public Health, I was working with Guy's Cancer and IBM Watson, and we were trying to clinically evaluate Watson for oncology, for breast cancer. And the then Chief of Cancer said to me, look, I'm getting approached almost every week by AI companies with, sexy, enticing tech that promises the earth with no evidence base for their validity. And so it was at that point that the post was created, and we've been working now on building a capability really at Guy's to clinically evaluate new and promising AI technology at the Cancer Centre in the cancer space. When we started in 2018, we looked for some consensus on how do you validate AI technology in healthcare, and we couldn't find any. No national consensus, no international consensus. And there was a lot of promising work happening from the likes of NICE, the Alan Turing Institute, the FDA, and others. So what we did is we collated all the best bits and produced a draft AI validation framework for healthcare, and started using it, and then we got in touch with BSI, and that's when we started on the BSI standard journey. We've essentially, with as Joe said, a very large group of multidisciplinary experts, taking that very skeletal draft framework and then adding the flesh and turning it into something which is auditable as a set of standards. And I'll hand you back to Haida.
Thank you, Danny. Lorna.
Hi, sorry about that. Good afternoon. My name is Lorna Harper. I'm the Head of Software and Informatics for the Medical Devices Unit in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board. My team design, develop and deploy medical device software with the aim of supporting clinicians to improve patient safety and the quality of clinical services through better software and more effective use of healthcare data. I was keen to get involved with this standard after some experience being asked to review AI devices that my health board were considering deploying, and I was really shocked by the quality of the technical detail that was supplied, and that's to say that there was no technical detail at all. And what shocked me even more was the fact that I was the only one on the review panel that noticed that there wasn't enough detail to determine if the device was safe and effective. And that's why I thought a validation framework for AI in healthcare sounded like a really great idea. I think we've got a skills shortage in the NHS of people who can determine the safety and efficacy of introducing AI-enabled devices into our services. So an auditable standard can act as a quality indicator that we can rely on, and that allows us to make more progress in introducing these products into our services, and where we simultaneously need to work to plug that skills gap.
Thank you, Lorna. Thanks, Lorna. I'm now going to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the standard. So panelists, you can turn your webcams off if you so choose. And if we could move to the next slide, please. Just a little bit of background from my perspective of how the standard started. In early 2020, I joined the board of Milton Keynes University Hospital, an organization renowned for trialing new technology and innovation. I'd been following the use of AI in healthcare, along with its possibilities and potential pitfalls. There was documented evidence of unintended consequences and ineffective outcomes that I'm sure you're all familiar with versus claims of the manufacturer, similar to what we've just heard from the other panelists. And there's also evidence of bias in training data sets leading to inequalities of care, etc. At the same time, the possibilities of the use and benefits of AI within healthcare are irrefutable. I felt it was important that innovative organizations like Milton Keynes were able to push the boundaries of innovation and research, but in a safe and effective manner. I wanted the public to benefit from novel and innovative interventions while at the same time being safeguarded from bias and other unintended consequences. Later in 2020, at a meeting of the BSI's Healthcare Organization Management Technical Committee, TC304, the chair, Adam Leyland, asked us all for suggestions for new standards. I suggested a standard for AI and its safe and effective use within healthcare, a standard that was applicable to any product that purported to use AI within a healthcare setting. I was very pleased that Adam and the BSI supported this suggestion. However, I had not realized that I'd just signed up to convene and chair a panel. I was introduced to Danny Rutter and Horace Schweb from Guy's and St. Thomas's, who had identified similar needs as you've just heard, and we started to recruit like-minded members of the panel, many that you have met today. Many who shared the view that although there was a wealth of guidance around AI, there were few, if any, auditable standards that were applicable to any application of AI within healthcare. We spent the next 2.5 years on a part-time basis working alongside incredibly talented and driven people to put together and refine elements of a validation framework for the use of AI within healthcare. A note on the use of this standard, of which the premise is straightforward. Organizations can choose to adopt the standard and mandate their suppliers to certify products to BS 30440. This would enable the provider organization to assure their clinicians, staff, their patients, and the public of a base level of safe and effective use, among many other important attributes, including carbon impact. Next slide, please. In much the same ways you would build good AI models, we were keen to ensure we had a diverse group, gender balance, and and as a UK standard representative of all 4 nations in the United Kingdom. We also were keen to ensure input from all parts of the health tech ecosystem, including industry, academia, developers, startups, think tanks, healthcare providers, both public and private, and government organizations such as NHSX, the MHRA, and NICE. This was representation, not endorsement, and many contributors gave up their own time to partake and held strict boundaries between their work on the panel and the confidentiality of the organizations they work for. Our intention has been to support the development of AI within healthcare by clearly articulating the basics of what good practice looks like, by providing a validation framework to sense check and audit against, and also dovetail this as much as possible with the direction that regulation and other standards are traveling to support accreditation as appropriate and minimize rework. The BSI standards lifecycle on the right is a strict process that mandates a 2-month public comment phase. We were keen to involve as many people as possible in this work, and so added to this lifecycle with an additional expert review phase, as well as a thorough patient and public engagement activity. I hope this provided you with a good overview of the why, who, and how, and I will now hand over to Danny, who put together the initial validation framework at Guy's and St Thomas', to take you through what BS 3044 contains. Danny, over to you.
Thanks, Haider. So the original draft framework that we set out, and we were really copying a sort of skeleton that the Alan Turing Institute had developed. And it takes each of the steps in the product development life cycle for an AI product, and then asks a set of questions, or in the case of these standards, develops a set of criteria that need to be addressed at each stage. So at the beginning here, you can see that even before you start to actually develop a product at the inception stage, there are some criteria, particularly around the healthcare need for the product, so that the product is driven by the need for the product in a healthcare setting, rather than because it's a great idea that some IT people thought about, in a laboratory. And then that moves through to the next stage of the actual development of the initial development of the product. And then there are criteria around stakeholder involvement, how the models are trained, and then further developed. The kind of human factors, the usability issues, issues around the interaction between human and AI, and there's one aspect of that is automation bias, and a much nicer term that I prefer is automation-induced complacency, which can creep in to that relationship between the health professionals or end users and the product. We also included criteria about carbon impact, and then moving on to the actual validation of the product. This was the focus of much of, and is the focus of much of our work at Guy's and St Thomas's, is the clinical, particularly around clinical evaluation. The actual effectiveness and cost effectiveness of the product. Then what external validity has been applied, issues around equity and bias, and then moving on to the actual deployment of the product, what the resource implications are, and the resource requirements are for deployment, what the actual real world costs are, and the impact on the system, and then issues around security and safeguarding. And then finally moving on to the post-market monitoring and the routine monitoring of the product once it has moved into routine use. So each of these steps in the cycle has a set of standards that we've developed over the last 2 years. I hand back to you now, Haider.
Thank you, Danny. Fantastic. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Fabulous. So now we're going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes If all the panelists could turn their cameras back on as well, and we'll go through some of the pre-submitted questions that hopefully answer a lot of the questions that you have in your minds today. So the first one is for Abdul and Alison, and if anyone else wants to jump in as well, just do wave at me. Abdul and Alison, please could you give us your thoughts on how mechanisms to measure and avoid bias in AI systems are considered in BS 30440. So Abdul first, please.
Great question. One that I really care about, I guess, from my intro. Machines are not biased, they operate on logic. However, what's biased is human, unconsciously or consciously. So what leads to bias is training data we supply, the engineer that makes the design choices and develops the algorithm, the tester that runs the test set, selects the test data set, and does the verification test and the validation set. So it's essential for us to consider bias in the whole life cycle of the development. A few aspects we need to consider. One, diverse and representative data sets are being selected to mitigate bias in AI training data. Metrics are developed to assess and mitigate bias in algorithms. Transparency and explainability are emphasized to detect and address bias in AI decision-making. Ethical guidelines and frameworks are being established to promote fairness and responsible AI use. And regular evaluation processes are being implemented to identify and rectify bias. So in this standard, what we do in, I think, section 6 or something, we ensure affected populations are involved as stakeholders from inception, both from a socioeconomic point of view and diversity point of view. So that is, we ensure stakeholders who will be affected by this AI have a say in the needs and requirements for the AI. Risk management to ensure identification of risk of bias in model development. And then in a later on clauses, we talk about mechanism, the keyword being mechanism, to monitor drift and underperformance for a subpopulation. This would be essentially has to be a joint responsibility because the supplier may not have access to the data, etc. And last not but least, a mechanism to report biases to supplier. The combination of these things, I think, goes a long way to address bias.
Thank you, Abdul. I can't really add too much more into your comments than that, other than say I think this standard is very important in that it doesn't separate out management of bias into one particular section, and it includes, you know, equity in development teams in that one. You'll find it sprinkled all the way through as a sort of foundational aspect of this, because you cannot produce anything that is safe and effective if it is biased. So as you read through, it might even begin to feel a little bit repetitive, because we talk about risk management of bias all there, and think about your stakeholders that are impacted but also input into the development process. But it is really hardwired into the whole of that standard. And I think very welcomed for me is that it is mentioned again in monitoring later on in that standard, that, you know, we understand the behavior of algorithms and that they can drift, and that we need to constantly address that one. So a big up to this standard, that it has it integrated within it all the way through the life cycle.
Thank you both. Lorna, if we could come to you, how, and a very pertinent one that I think we had lots of questions around in the pre-submitted bunch, how will the standard support compliance to the general safety and performance requirements of EU MDR, medical device regulation?
So as many people on this webinar will be aware, regulatory compliance is demonstrated through compliance with harmonised standards. So for software as a medical device in general, there are only 2 harmonised standards for EU MDR at the moment, and that's 13485, the Medical Device Quality Management System standard, and there's also 14971, which is the Medical Device Risk Management standard. So there are a few other relevant standards, such as 62366 about usability engineering for medical devices, and also 62304, which is medical device software lifecycle. But if we just focus on the two that are harmonised at the moment, that will allow you to comply with the EU MDR. In 13485, there's a whole section on process requirements associated with product realisation, and that includes planning, design and development, and verification and validation activities. I think BS 30440 gives suppliers a practical guidance on how to meaningfully fulfil their quality management obligations in relation to AI-enabled software as a medical device. And I don't think it's possible to comply with 14971 and accurately manage risks without engaging in some of the activities that we suggest in this standard. So I think that BS 30440 will guide suppliers to compliance with these standards and the general safety and performance criteria of the EU MDR. I think it provides much needed practical guidance for how to comply with these standards. And these standards were initially developed for hardware, with hardware devices in mind. So that there is definitely a gap around software as a medical device and giving people that practical advice as to how to actually fulfill their obligations. And I think, and that goes even more so for AI devices. So I think that's what we are trying to address here. And that's particularly around the more technical aspects of development and validation that we've focused on in this standard that maybe some of the other standards don't focus on as much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lorna. If we could come to Joe now, please. Joe, how does the validation framework address continuous learning of AI in the world of medical devices?
Okay. That's a very good question. And I presume that the person who posed it is accepting the fact that AI systems are seldom static. They're not something that can be coded and will stay static over time. What I like about the standard is it looks for continuous evidence of a supplier and a buyer working together to validate trustworthiness, accountability in the design, the development and the deployment of a system, because it is a continuous learning system. So if the people have got evidence of being able to do that, they will be making safe and accepting the fact that AI is not a static type product. How the standard differs from maybe other approaches for doing this is it does look at that complete life cycle of processing. So it's not just about the validation, say, of a model, which is subsequently deployed in a piece of software, which is subsequently deployed in a device of some form. It's looking at how the model is designed, how it's developed, how it's deployed, and how it's monitored. Because as Alison made reference to, systems can change over time. And the system, if you implement the standard as it is, the ability to continuously learn and make your product safe and fit for purpose is evident. And it gives what I like about it is it gives the supplier a template to say, okay, we're doing this, but it also gives the buyer the ability to have a meaningful conversation with the supplier about the fact that they're doing this, because not everybody, I think as was alluded to earlier on, is au fait with the process of designing and developing and deploying systems. So if you want a continuous learning environment, both parties need to have a parity of understanding. And that exists within that standard. So that's where I think continuous learning is embodied in it, because in each individual element, from the design to the decommissioning, there's a process of continuous learning that suppliers and buyers can make evident.
Thank you, Joe. If I could come to Danny now, and Lorna, perhaps you want to comment on this one as well after Danny. Why is the NHS slow in adopting AI in diagnosis and triage, Danny?
Wow. I think most people listening to this who have had any interaction with the NHS at all will know that there are lots and lots of different answers to this question. And the way I try and think about it is kind of micro level explanations, sort of meso level and macro level. And it's probably fair to say that the inertia and the slowness to adopt is not in the NHS is not just specific to AI. I mean, it really relates to any form of innovation really in healthcare. You know, at the micro level, particularly at the level of a hospital, decision making in the NHS, particularly at a hospital level, is incredibly fragmented and chaotic and often completely disorganized. And although you might think the chief executive of an NHS trust is in charge, in practice, there isn't really anybody in charge. There are lots and lots of competing, conflicting interests. So you know, it's often a miracle that anything new gets introduced into the NHS, and some of that lack of command and control relates to one of the real macro level reasons, which I'll talk about in a sec, which is about the power of the medical profession. Again, at the micro level, particularly in hospitals, and the larger the hospital, the bigger the issue, that the IT tail wags the hospital dog, you know, getting anything deployed through an IT department requires many layers of bureaucracy, of information governance, and most IT departments in the NHS are under-resourced, they're under-skilled, particularly the new skills that are required to understand and deal with AI technology. And I think it's also fair to say that IT people are not by nature very open-minded. You know, that's not the kind of person that makes a good coder. At the meso level, you know, the level of a health authority, planning and decision making at health authority level is incredibly short-sighted. It almost always just relates to one financial cycle. Health authorities are incredibly risk averse, and there's no money. there's no money to invest. At the macro level, and I think probably this is the major reason why innovation in healthcare, and this is international, this is a global phenomenon, is that, you know, for all sorts of historical reasons that go back 500-600 years to the founding of the Royal College of Physicians, the medical voice is the most powerful voice in healthcare. The doctor's voice is the most powerful voice in healthcare, and doctors invoke clinical freedom rather than doing what their manager tells them to do, and that's still doing, despite the many efforts to try and curtail and control the power of the medical profession. None of them have really succeeded. If doctors have the power, and through their clinical decisions they spend the resources, you know, their Hippocratic Oath says first do no harm, so they have a very healthy level of skepticism about anything new. They're wedded to the RCT kind of worldview of evidence, and building a body of RCT evidence takes 10 to 15 years, and AI is evolving, you know, in weeks, not years. And then again, I think doctors, by the sort of people that come into medicine, they tend to be more conservative by nature, which I think links to that Hippocratic Oath. So that's just some of the reasons why the NHS is slow to innovate. Let's see what happens in the next couple of years, whether we manage to get round some of those challenges and obstacles.
Thanks, Danny. Lorna, your quick thoughts on that?
Firstly, I'd just like to challenge the idea that coders are not very open-minded. But I agree with Danny, there's lots of different reasons why the NHS is slow at adopting AI. One of them is definitely the skills and resources. They're just not readily available to do a thorough evaluation of the safety and efficacy of these devices, and the complex ecosystem that they're also intended to act on. So and that's especially true if the starting point for the evaluation is working out what information is required, what do I need to know to work out if this is safe and effective, and then spending a lot of time trying to extract this information from suppliers. So if we can start addressing some of these issues, like introducing auditable standards, that will help to reduce that burden, so that if we're trying to do that evaluation, we've got a much better starting place, then we might get there a bit quicker. But if we don't start addressing some of these issues, then that we're just not going to get any faster at this, and it's going to drag on the same way as it has for most technologies in the NHS.
Thanks, Lorna, and I completely agree with you there. Okay, folks, so we've got about 10 to 15 minutes left for this session. So, and I'd like to get through as many questions as possible. So Abdul, question for you. Should standards mandate human oversight for AI? Many questions alluded to this. What are your thoughts?
Great question, Hader. Should standards mandate human oversight? It's a heated topic in many areas, and it's very, very relevant to healthcare. I see the point for both cases. If we take an example, maybe an extreme example, if I think of one, imagine an AI that has to administer a critical life-saving dose and it goes wrong intermittently only 5% of the time. Should humans be allowed to override that? And imagine another situation where an AI is tracking something very, very fast, and if the human takes control over it, it risks doing harm instead of fixing it. In the first case, I guess you'd want to allow human oversight. In the second case, you would not. So both situations have their merits. So this standard doesn't take a set position, a blanket yes or no. It has clauses that essentially say that when there is no human oversight, the risks associated with the AI need to be looked at and explained. And when there is ability to override the AI from autonomous to manual mode, what are the risks and how are those risks mitigated? That's the key thing. How are risks mitigated? And so in the case of a system that's too fast, perhaps the mitigation is you have to wait for it to get to a certain point, or there's an override only a certain capable user can take, etc. So in my opinion, giving that freedom allows suppliers to come up with the best safety case and handle what situations need to be handled, allowing both situations which are valid and required.
Thank you, Abdul. So another great question coming up, and Alison, Abdul, and Joe, love your quick thoughts on this one. What are your thoughts on harmonization with other standards and regulation? Alison first, please.
I will link in with Abdul's previous comment about, and then it is related to this, that there is harmonization with other standards, but we do have additions. And one of the additions is, a commentary on automation bias and human factors as well. So, this idea of human oversight is integrated, so we kept up to date. It is not possible to harmonize in a 100% way with all of the standards that are out there at the moment. However, and Joe will pick up on this, has tracked them quite well as to what standards we have addressed. The development team of BS 30440 have included, not endorsed by, but have included representatives of NICE, who've developed the ESF. There have been over, some MHRA input into it and so on and so forth. And many of us on the committee sit on a number of standards bodies and committees throughout. And so we've kept an eye on it. I think one of the key things to remember is that this is a fast developing field. Many of the standards are still in production. So we have some AI specific standards in production. We have software as a medical device standards that we have been looking at. Some apply very well, some don't apply, and some have left gaps, of which case I shall hand over to Joe to talk about the big black box.
Okay, I wish I'd mentioned that now. On the subject of harmonisation, as Alison just mentioned, there are different villages raising different standards, and there is really no significant harmonization unless you bring together a village of people who care and want it to be applicable across many sectors. And that's what HED has done. He's brought together a group of people who've got that sort of interest. So the first question we get asked when trying to explain what 30400 is how is it different to other things? And I would say it's different insofar as it's the only standard currently that looks at AI as in the maths, the computer science, and the compute that's subsequently embodied in something that gets deployed, that looks at things at a complete life cycle where both buyer and supplier is involved. But if you try and compare its coverage to other standards, and if I'm looking at it from a supplier's perspective, if I was trying to comply with 30440, I've got between 40 and 80% of lots of other standards covered in the process of doing that. So if I'm coming into the healthcare system new and I apply and I'm in AI, I know I'm going to get lots of those things covered, which is very helpful, not least when, if you think and you look into the subject areas of trust and transparency that are covered in the standard, when the EU AI Act comes forward and addressing this in more detail, there's a lot of things that are embodied there. So it's brought together a lot of people's experience and wish and desire to get AI systems together and out of the door. In terms of harmonization, this process is just a process. We've been through 2 years. This will continue. Everybody here is interested to make sure that it's embodied and it continues to develop and is harmonized, and we all learn from other villages. So that's where I'm hoping it's going to continue.
Thank you, Joe. Abdul, do you want to any quick thoughts on?
Just a few quick thoughts. So there's approximately in the ISO IEC space 40 to 50 standards related to AI and data. In the medical device specific area, there's about 3 to 4. I'm sure each country around the world has many AI related standards in development, some released. Harmonization will mean, as Alison says, to align all of these. The good thing is when we've looked at these, a lot of these are saying the same thing or very similar thing. It's just a matter of aligning the words. That's easier said than done when you have so many organizations, so many groups to work with. But that is something we need to look at going forward in the future, because we will all need to align to some extent.
Can I just add into that very quickly, Hader? I promise, keep an eye on the time, that this standard is auditable. And that as you go through it in these auditable statements, we are requiring that you document for a particular process, that you document your risk management process, and so on and so forth. So we're not specifying how necessarily you do that documentation. So it allows you the flexibility to fulfill those other standards that you're requiring. There's some of them which are designated, that you need to have really if you want to get deployed into the NHS, and it just allows you then to link in all of that aspects there. So that's a really important point to make for this standard.
Thank you, Alison. Absolutely. Lorna, if we could come back to you, please. Will this standard prevent real-world clinical data from being used to test AI?
No, it can't. So real-world clinical data is going to be required to test these AI devices, because this is the kind of messy data that they're going to encounter once they're deployed. So if the device that's been developed, the AI device, can't handle the inherent variability in the data, it needs to be able to at least handle it safely. And that's why it's important to include the detail around the training and the testing data that's used in development, and that will allow healthcare institutions to understand how applicable the AI algorithm is to the data they actually hold in their organisation and plan round about that. So no.
Thank you, Lorna. And for the person who submitted that question, we did change your question slightly because the original was quite long. So, but I hope that answered the essence of your question. Next question, please, for Joe. Does the panel envisage this standard to be mandatory or voluntary? And if mandatory, who would be responsible for the auditing? Would this impose an even greater burden on backlogs? So Joe, please, and then perhaps Alison.
Okay. No, it's a standard. It's a voluntary standard, and that's where it stands. It's there to be used. I do hope it is used, Because as I talked about at the beginning, when people look at the investment that goes into AI, not a lot of thinking has gone into making decisions as to whether that investment is fit for purpose. And if you're a buyer, you get to understand the framework by which you can assess suppliers in terms of the product development process. If you're a supplier, you get to understand that you've got a common language with which you can engage people in healthcare about your AI system and how not just the product, but the process from beginning to end is valid for use in the AI in the healthcare sector. So it is voluntary, it's not mandatory.
Thank you. Alison, do you have any quick thoughts on that, or did Joe cover it?
He did cover it. There's just one thing I would say, and it links back to a question I think that Lorna and Danny addressed about NHS slow in adopting AI in diagnosis and triage. It is voluntary, but it is hard for people to make the procurement decisions and to know what they're procuring, and then also to know what is needed going onwards once it's developed and implemented within the systems, how then that sort of assurance will carry on. And so yes, whilst it's voluntary, it may eventually one day in the distant future sort of become a sort of an easy ask for organisation, for commissioners to know, well, if you've got that, I know where you are at. Because one of the problems that people have in getting tech and innovation through into the NHS is the variability of requirements between, for example, trusts. You know, a classic example I had was one organisation for the same project. It took a week to get the DPIA approved, and then another one it was over a year. So this may smooth that pathway, and it will give you a competitive edge if you have it. And so a little bit like DTAC is becoming, which is still not quite mandatory, is that it's like, have you got it, and it automatically becomes almost a requirement. So theoretically it could happen. With regards to auditing, that's a bigger question, and that's a developing field, and I shall back that back to Hader probably.
Hader, can I just also add, so many times in the last few months, we've been talking to AI companies at the Cancer Centre who've approached us, and I've been thinking, if only our standard was published, I could just give it to them and say, look, could you just let us know how many of these criteria you can meet, and give us a rough idea of how you've met them, so because it would make life so much easier to weed out the good ones from the not so good ones. And of course, if companies were able to come to us and say, actually, we've had it audited properly, formally, and here's the audit report, I think it could paradoxically speed up adoption rather than slow it down.
Can I pick up? Danny. I would agree completely. It is. Sorry, I would agree that it's the lack of evidence that makes buyers of AI in the healthcare so concerned. If suppliers accept it's just a voluntary standard and came and said, this is the degree, here's the evidence of compliance against this code, they've got a meaning, they will completely differentiate themselves from a lot of people whose technology sometimes gets thrown into healthcare without being duly considered. And it ends up being a problem for everybody concerned.
Thank you, Joe. I think that the last comments from all of you were incredibly helpful. All I'd say on auditing is watch this space. There are lots of companies that are interested in being auditors, and we're having discussions with all of them. If there's anyone listening on this webinar, then please get in touch with us. We took great measures to add lots of illustrative examples and guidance to the standard, which hopefully will be helpful to both suppliers and auditors, but this is an evolving space, and dare I say it, fairly groundbreaking. So this is going to be something that we'll be thinking of more as we move forward. Last question then, and then we really should go to the Q&A. Danny, last question for you. If there is no ground truth, how can we validate AI? And I appreciate this is could be a very long answer, but if I could ask you for a shortened version, please, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, the really short answer is and because there often isn't a ground truth. And I remember when I was a student doing an MPH at the London School of Hygiene, our professor, the late Geoffrey Rose, in his lecture on screening said, you know, the only real gold standard is God's version of the truth, because it's so often impossible to agree on a gold standard. So you use the next best thing. And you know, very quick example. So we've been evaluating as part of an NIHR funded project, an expert system that makes treatment recommendations for prostate cancer. We've been looking to see whether we can use it as a triage tool, so that for the less complex patients, instead of going to an MDT, the expert system with some human supervision triages, you know, a good number of the patients away from the MDT. We could have used the actual MDT recommendation as the gold standard, as the ground truth, but often, you know, our MDT disagree with each other. So the next best thing was to actually get a bunch of urologists, in this case, independently to review a group of patients and give their treatment recommendations. And then where they disagreed with each other, we constituted a kind of a panel, a consensus panel, to try and arbitrate, so that we ended up with a ground truth of, you know, the best practice treatment recommendations for that group of patients. And then we compared that with the expert system. It's not a ground truth, but it's the next best thing.
Fabulous, Danny. Thank you. And with that, I think we'll pass it back to Nikki for some of the Q&A questions. Nikki, are you there?
Yep. Sorry, my webcam is being a bit slow. Right, that was brilliant. Thank you. So we've had a lot of questions come in, and we're not going to get to answer all of them, unfortunately. But just for a couple, can the standard be used retroactively on a product currently in development? And if so, how? I'm not sure who wants to answer that one.
I would say it can, but it's where
the short answer.
Sorry, Hader. Okay, you can do it. Yes, absolutely. And you know, it depends on how long into your development life cycle that you are, because where you have identified gaps, you know, you're going to have to go back and fill those gaps again, and hopefully that isn't going to cause you to have to redevelop or make any significant change. But yes, of course you can. And it would be good practice to do that, you know, because we have parts in the standard that, you know, deals with sustainability and carbon zero requirements, which is going to grow and grow and grow. So yes, short answer is yes.
And I would add that in essence, you're almost future-proofing your product. If you stuck to the standard and you picked elements out of the standard that are appropriate to your organization, then you're almost future-proofing what you're developing for the way in which people are thinking about AI in healthcare.
And not just that, you know, the better your record keeping is, the more likely you are to be able to evidence what you did at inception, for example. And that's often a kind of a good litmus test of how good the company is and how good the product is, if they've actually got good record keeping. So
brilliant, thank you. Is it anticipated that this standard will or could become an NHS procurement requirement?
Can't say at this stage. It'll require some stakeholder engagement and presentations, but I very much doubt it would be something that would be sort of particularly mandated at this stage. But as said, it's in early days.
I think Alison's absolutely right, and all I would add to that is, I think over the next year we'll be testing this standard in a lot of real-world situations, and just like anything, it'll be based on its successful use within the sector. So we'd love like-minded organizations to adopt it, and we'd like to refine it, and we'd like to get it even better than it is at the moment. And then hopefully one day people will believe in its use and in its effectiveness, and then, you know, the world is open for adoption. in that sense.
Yeah,
I'd just add to that that although it's not a requirement and it is a voluntary standard, like if people do show that some kind of compliance with it, even if it's not the whole standard, it does differentiate you from your competitors. So it would be advantageous to do so, I would suggest.
And I think as Lorna's alluded to, really, the market will decide, you know, if it's filling an unmet need amongst customers, then it will start to grow in popularity, and you know, it may informally become a procurement requirement, even if it's not formally.
And I think also, just to add, people need to bear in mind that people have been aware of this standard as it's been developed. People in NHS have been aware of it, and I've seen elements of the standard manifest themselves in guidance being provided by government to purchasers and suppliers. So it's getting into the standard and understanding its elements is going to help people become more competitive, as Danny made out.
And I will just very cheekily put my nice hat on and say, you know, for example, if you come to us to have a meta gap analysis done, you know, when you're in the early stages, I mean, I wrote the AI section for that, and we are beginning to ask these deeper questions within that for that validation of that. So, you know, the evidence will be asked for, and if you're doing this standard, you are developing the evidence.
Brilliant, thank you. So possibly the last question then for today. A single AI product can have different use cases in different settings. Is the framework created once for each AI product, or for every project this AI product is deployed in? So who would like to answer that one?
Can I jump in? Intended purpose is really, really important. If you change the intended purpose, you need to go through the process again.
If I may add, I would agree with that, because the safety case is very dependent on what you use it for. Without an insight into how it's going to be used, you cannot really root out what are the risks, what are the mitigations you need. So it's essential to do that with the intended use in mind.
And likewise, going back to the very first question on bias, and you know, if you change in the use case, your demographic and your intended sort of target users or people impacted by it may vary as well. So go back to what Abdul says, your risk mitigations completely vary. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Maybe a quick last one. Is there a plan for taking this to CEN or ISO?
I'll jump in. I think currently there isn't, but it goes back to its successful adoption and evolution over the next year. That's always been part of the trajectory of where it could go, but categorically there are no current plans at the moment to take it to ISO level.
Brilliant.
And STEN are adopting a lot of the ISO standards for harmonisation purposes. So it's worth thinking about who you go to first on that.
Right, well, I think that takes us right to the very end of our webinar. Thank you everybody for attending. We hope you found it informative and interesting and enjoyable. Cheers. Thank you to the panel as well.
Thank you.